Hello everyone. Today I'm going to talk to you about approaches, methods, and activities in English language teaching. Now, to start, let me tell you about when I was learning French in Canada in the 1970s. What we would spend a lot of time doing is parsing sentences. What is parsing? It's not a word you've maybe heard because it's not such a popular method for teaching language anymore. We'd have a sentence like you see here, les chiens chassent les chats, the dogs chase the cats. And you would go through word by word, so you would take the word les, and you would write down that it is a definite article, as opposed to an indefinite article, right? The instead of a. And it's masculine because nouns in French are either masculine or feminine, and it's chien, not chienne, and it's plural because there's the S on the end of chien, and so les is chien as opposed to les chiens is plural, and so on, right? And then you would write this in full sentences, each one, right? So les un article défini, and so on, full sentences, and then you'd go on to the next word, and you'd do it all again, and chien is a common noun, not a proper noun, it's not a name, right? And so on. And you would do this through the whole sentence. And you would have 10 sentences, and you would parse them all, and that could take a 45-minute lesson, and that was your language learning of French for the day. Now, when I see a language learning class, what do I see? Sometimes something completely different, right? Children dancing here, as you see, and playing find someone who likes chocolate ice cream, find someone who doesn't like chocolate ice cream, and you walk around asking people in French questions about what they like or dislike, singing songs, trying to elicit information, right? Ask them their name, ask them where they live, things like that, making posters together, talking about the poster, using the words for colors and so on, doing gap fill exercises where you have a missing word. It might say les chassent les chats, and you'd say the somethings chase the cats, and you could put in whatever you think fits there, probably dogs, but you may put something else as long as it works, right? And they're even playing games, having a great time, right? Quite a different experience than I had with my sentence parsing. Now, what's going on here, right? We've got the discussion of approach, method, and activity, and we'll come back to the sentence parsing and the dancing after we've talked a bit about what is meant by approach, method, and activity in language teaching. We have these terms coming from an American linguist, Edward Anthony, gave us these terms, and you should picture them as a hierarchy, right? As an hierarchy with approach at the top, and an approach can have different methods, and a method can have different activities. So it's a hierarchical organization. The approach is the top level, where the most abstract thinking about what is language, what is learning. It's at the approach level that you lay down those fundamental principles of what you think language and learning are. And we'll see examples in a minute, right? When it comes to method, then this is where you have your plan, right? I've got my approach, my thinking about what language is and what learning is. I designed a suitable method, my overall plan for presenting the lessons throughout the course, the year, the program, whatever it is, right? Here, this is what you'd call the curriculum level. You've got your curriculum for language teaching, is your method based on your approach. Then the individual activity is where you implement the lesson in the classroom, right? What are we doing today? Your lesson plan is the activity. I've written technique in brackets because Anthony used the terms approach, method, and technique. I think you'll find more common now in literature is that people will use the word activity. So if you do go back to Anthony, you'll see the word technique. More common now, though, you'll see the term activity. So the activity is the actual individual lesson which is used to implement your method, your curriculum, and your method is driven by your approach to language teaching. At the language approach level, here's where it's useful to distinguish between two well-known thinkers about human behavior in general, but especially to do with language teaching and language, rather with language primarily, right? We have B.F. Skinner and we have Noam Chomsky. Skinner is known for having thought about the Pavlov's dogs experiment, right? Pavlov's dogs, you probably know the term. If you don't, let's just be clear, right? So Pavlov was keeping dogs for experimental purposes. The dogs would salivate when they were given their food, right? Their mouths would produce saliva. The saliva helps with the ingestion and digestion of the food. Makes sense, right? What Pavlov noticed was that the dogs would start to salivate just when they saw the person, the assistant who brought the food. And even if that person wasn't bringing food at the time, it would sometimes cause the dogs to react as if it was feeding time, right? So this is, Pavlov's dogs should bring up that idea that people, dogs in this case, that dogs learn through behaviorism, right? That repeated behavior leads to learning. The repetition of the assistant coming in with the food led to the dog's learned behavior of reacting to the assistant and in fact physically reacting by producing saliva in the mouth. Behaviorism would account for learning something for humans like tennis or guitar, right? How do you learn to play tennis? The first time you swing, you probably have poor control over the motion of the racket and the wrist control is probably poor and you aren't able to control the ball in the right way. Similarly, when you play a guitar the first time, you probably can't even put your fingers in the right position to make the chords, much less do that and this at the same time. But you do it over and over and you learn to do it properly, right? So behaviorism is learning through repetition. Skinner wrote the book Verbal Behavior, which attempted to explain language through language and language learning as a form of behaviorism, that we repeat language over and over until we get it right. Verbal behavior is spelled with an O because it was an American book. Behaviorism above, I've written in British English with the U. Language is learned, right? Language is learned through repetition. Now, on the other side of this argument, later coming along was Chomsky, Noam Chomsky, one of the world's best-known linguists. Chomsky, his ideas didn't come from seeing Pavlov's dogs. His ideas came from observing children and the way they learned language. And he noticed interesting things about children that seemed to contradict the idea that children could be learning language as a form of behaviorism. Think of how children learn language, right? When you teach someone to play a guitar, you show them how to make the chord properly. When you teach someone to play tennis, you show them how to swing properly. What do we do when we talk to children? Not necessarily teach. What do we do when we talk to children? We do a lot of things incorrectly. Babies are told goo goo gaga, goo goo gaga. Nonsense. Yet the babies never actually produce that, right? People talk to young children using very strange pronoun reference, right? They'll say things to children like, "How's my little man? Is he hungry?" And they're using a third person pronoun he to address what should be a second person pronoun you, right? So how's my little man? Is he hungry? In standard English, you'd say, how are you? Are you hungry, right? Saying, how's my little man? Is he hungry? Sounds like you're talking to someone else when you're in fact addressing the child in front of you. People don't learn to do this though, right? People don't start doing this because they hear this, right? One final example that's quite interesting. Parents tend to correct their children for truth, not to correct their children for grammatical accuracy. What I mean is the child will go to the park with a parent or a carer, come home and tell the other parent or tell the carer We goed on the swings. We goed on the swings at the park, right? And the parent who is there will say, it was the slide. So they'll correct the fact. It wasn't the swings we went on, it was the slide. But they don't necessarily correct that we goed on the swings, or they may correct it implicitly by saying we went on, right? But they don't tend to say something like, the past tense of go is went. They don't correct them explicitly, right? So, we don't want our children to be liars, swings versus slide, but we're not so bothered if our children make grammatical mistakes, because we tend to just think that, well, eventually they'll grow out of it. And they do, right? So it was this and many other things that led Chomsky to reject behaviorism and come up with his idea of universal grammar, the idea that grammar is natural to humans, that language is natural to humans, much like breathing is. You don't have to learn to do it. Unlike tennis and guitar, you breathe from the moment you're born, assuming all goes well, right? So language for humans is part of them, like breathing, and that when you're growing up and you hear people talk and eventually start to read things, really, Chomsky said something much smaller is going on. You're just learning which options are possible in your language and which ones are not necessary. So in the universal grammar, all languages might have gender. If you grow up hearing French and you hear le chien and la chien, le and la marking the gender, you realize, this language that I'm growing up to speak uses gender. If you grow up speaking English and hear the dog and there's no marking of whether it's female or male, you discount gender from then on and realize it's not part of the grammar of your language. So Chomsky thought language learning is not behavioral and wrote a review of Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior, criticizing behaviorism as a form of language learning, and said in a sense that language is innate to people, right? You can see that really what you have here is the age-old nature versus nurture approach. Is language nurtured in us, as in Skinner's case, or is language natural to us, as in Chomsky's case, right? These are two different approaches to thinking about what language is, how language is developed, how language is learned. With these two approaches, and well, with Chomsky's approach really, right, as the let's say winner in this debate, at least as far as linguists are concerned, the Chomskyan approach to language is the one that now dominates. Novel methods, that next level from Anthony's hierarchy, novel methods emerged through decades after Chomsky, and even before. These methods emerged as ways of thinking about how to teach language, with the underlying assumption that Chomskyan linguistics was the right way to think about language. These novel methods appeared. Now, these methods are often interesting historically. The audiolingual method, as you see here, which is focused largely on really describing the sounds, the words, and the grammar, right? The sounds, the phonology, the words, the lexis, and the grammar, the morphology and syntax. The audiolingual method focused on describing those elements of language very accurately and in depth. It's quite interesting where this came from. The US Army, the American Army, wanting to teach languages to people, languages where textbooks weren't available. How do you teach a language when a textbook's not available? Well, you get someone who speaks that language. But what if that person's not a language teacher? They may not know what to do, how to teach effectively. So the Army linguists would have a native speaker of whatever language, and they'd use them as an informant to teach people that person's language. And so they'd ask them probing questions about the sounds. Please tell us how to say this. Probing questions about the grammar. How do you show that something is future or past, and so on, right? So as I said, the audiolingual method grew out of this quite interesting situation of having to teach people a language when no textbooks were available. But for the most part, this method and a couple of the others I'll list here are really interesting only now as historical artifacts, right, of learning your history of ELT, your history of English language learning. The total physical response method was based on the theory that children mostly learn language by responding to commands. When you're a child, you get told what to do a lot. Eat your breakfast, drink your milk, go to sleep, be quiet, stop bothering me, whatever it is that parents say to kids. A lot of it is to do with commands, and so the theory with total physical response was that we should similarly teach adults by using commands and having them respond physically to the commands, and that it would build up some connection between the spoken language command, the imperative verb in all those cases I gave, right? Be quiet, drink your milk, and so on. That it would build up some sort of link between the command and the response, and it would lead to language learning. Not a method that we think about too much now as being successful in any way. The silent way, the teacher is quiet, the students talk and solve problems. Again, interesting as a historical artifact, and not something we think about too much now. Finally, the Suggestopedia, such a novel name, one that people who study TESOL will remember for decades after they ever hear it. The idea of using art and music, a bit of music playing, some comfortable chairs to sit in the classroom so everyone can relax. And apparently this calm, soothing music and relaxing chairs will allow the language to flow into you through some sort of osmosis, some sort of linguistic osmosis. A method with an interesting name, not one that we hear much about anymore. The big two methods that dominate now are the grammar translation method and the communicative language teaching method, right? Grammar translation and CLT are really the two methods that are in use, that have been used, and that other methods draw on, and they may be given, you may find new names of methods that are not these two, but you'll quickly see that, this is a method related to grammar translation, or this is a method that's more focused on communicative language teaching. Pretty much all methods can be put under the umbrella term of being a grammar translation method or a communicative language teaching method. Grammar translation, as you would guess, comes from, is focused on translating grammar from one language to another, right? Translating from language A to the language you're trying to learn. The other way around, right? That for people learning Latin, you will have Latin sentences and you'll translate them word by word from Latin to English in order to learn the language. This is often rote learning is involved, right? Doing things over and over. Often call and response. If it's in a classroom, it's often sort of call and response, repeating after what the teacher says over and over, right? But really, because the goal is often reading text in the target language, most of the focus is on reading and writing in the grammar translation method. Richards and Rogers call this a method for which there is no theory, critical of it. That's not to say that it doesn't have some good points, which we'll look at a little bit later. As for communicative language teaching, the idea was that we would teach the second language, the L2, like a child learns the L1, the first language. There's very little translation, because when you're teaching someone their first language, you can't translate if they only know one language, right? There's no available translation. Little explicit teaching of grammar. You may sometimes comment that, someone's like the child saying, we go to the park. You may say, it's we went to the park. But you probably don't use the linguistic terminology and say, that go is present and the past simple is went, and that you are confusing the issue by using ed, which happens with some verbs, but those are regular verbs. like walk, walked, whereas go is an irregular verb, go, went. You don't get into all that with the grammar translation method, especially not at first, right? So you would correct someone's grammar perhaps just by saying it properly, but you wouldn't get into the instruction, right? Few or no textbooks used in communicative language teaching, unlike with grammar translation, especially think of Latin. You can't find Latin speakers to talk to, or at least not native Latin speakers, right? Communicative language teaching needs skilled, fluent teachers in order to teach effectively. So it's not without problems, right? I mean, Richards and Rogers said that grammar translation was a method for which there is no theory, claiming that it's problematic from a theoretical point of view. Communicative language teaching can be very problematic from a practical point of view. You need skilled, fluent teachers, and it often ignores the classroom reality of, a teacher with 20, 30, 40 children, even if she, he, they is a very skilled teacher. If they've got an hour of lesson to teach those children, an hour of lesson twice a week or something, it ignores that classroom reality that each child will get very little teacher time compared to learning in L1, when as a child you have pretty much the undivided attention of a parent or parents. If you've grown up, fortunately, in that situation, a sibling or two or three siblings, you're sharing very little of your time with everyone else, unlike in a classroom with 30 or 40 kids. These are the big two methods. They both have their purposes and can be effective, but they both do have their problems as well. Getting down to the language activity level, the third level of Edwards' hierarchy, the language activity, well, what do we actually do in the classroom? I've sort of said some of this already now, right, as I talk, but what do you actually do in the classroom? With grammar translation, the focus is on reading and writing. You're going to spend a lot of your time interacting with a written text. You're going to maybe do some speaking, some sort of repetition of minimal pairs. If you're learning English, you might do a lot of time saying bat, mat, hat, cat, right? Some repetition like that, but it'll often be quite, repetitive, right? Doing it over and over and over. Just a list of words decontextualized, right? Just repeating the words over and over, cat, bat, mat, hat, in order to learn the sounds. But you'll probably spend most of your time doing writing and focusing on the form, right? Really trying to get the grammar correct, right? The focus is on the form, getting the spelling correct, getting the grammar correct as you progress through the lessons. Communicative language teaching activities are more likely to focus on speaking and listening. Again, especially at first, things may change over time, but to focus on speaking and listening, to focus on interacting with people as opposed to interacting with a written text. You'll be interacting with people. You'll be doing things like giving directions, where the focus will be on the meaning more than on the form. So in a communicative language teaching activity, you may be asked to give directions. You have a map and you're told, tell your classmate how to get from here to the bank. And you may say things like, go straight, left turn time, up walk, or something like that, where you're trying to focus on the meaning, which might be go straight, turn left, walk up the street. You may not say it with perfect form, but that's not considered to be important, again, at least at first with communicative language teaching, because the idea is that if you focus on communication, the form and the accuracy will come later. So, what should you consider about this as you progress through your studies of English language teaching methods and activities? Think about an activity that you used as a teacher or learner yourself. Something like we saw earlier, gap fill or eliciting or what have you. Try to remember what context was it used. Was it something, what was the class size? Were the students young or old? Were they beginners or advanced? What country was it in, right? that's something that's always important in discussions of language teaching, because there's a big difference if you're talking about teaching English in Britain to immigrants, as opposed to, say, if you're teaching English in Japan to Japanese kids learning English. The environment is completely different. Something like grammar translation, which is often derided by Western linguists, right? Grammar translation, it's had its time, it's not valuable anymore. They're forgetting that in a certain context, like say in Japan and other countries, grammar translation is very important because passing exams in order to progress from elementary school to junior high school to high school, high school to university for job hunting purposes, passing exams is often necessary to have a high level of knowledge about English form. Nobody cares if you can talk English to other people. What matters is that if you learnt the proper grammar and forms. So that's why when you're thinking of your activity and you go on to thinking about what approach and method led to it and was it successful or not, you have to think about to whom were you teaching or who was teaching you and where were you, because that helps you think about the purpose, right? Purposes can be quite different in different contexts, and it's very easy to disparage something that might not seem logical here, but can be very logical there. So this is what I'd like you to do as you think and study and research on English language teaching approaches, methods, and activities, techniques, is to think of something that you've done or learned, think about where and how and why it was done, think about what was the underpinning approach, and then think about was it successful or not, and would it suit or be successful in other places. That's the kind of thing that you should be doing as you progress through your research. Thank you very much for your time. Here's the references that you can use in order to further your study of these topics. Thank you. Bye.